I'd like to start out by thanking Patricia Massy for the opportunity to have the show here. I'm quite inspired by what she's doing here, actually. First time I was in here, the first thing I came across after about a minute was an amazing translation of Leibniz's philosophical writings, which you don't see much. And so I was kind of a convert from that point on. But there's a section downstairs, actually there's a whole wall on indigenous writers, indigenous issues, and they have a lot of poetry readings here and book launches, probably more than anywhere else in town. I think there were 3 events last week. I'm not sure how many this week, so you know, it feels like it's really quite a significant location in Vancouver culture at this point. So you know, I'm really happy to participate in that with them. So I'd really like to thank Patricia, and I'd like to thank my wife Natalie Funk, who is over here, and she's been really helpful in, you know, all phases of this show, from, you know, selecting the images and doing the printing and the framing to, she put the show together over here. Well, she got the technology together for this really interesting display of images here, where all the Massy people need to do is unplug it at night and plug it in the morning, and you know, they don't have to know anything about computers. They just unplug it. That's perfect, you know. So many thanks, Natalie, for all your help and support. And I'd like to thank my collaborators, Bill Bissett and Jim Leftwich. The images on this wall are done in collaboration with the legendary poet Bill Bissett, and the 3 images over here were done in collaboration with the Virginia visual poet Jim Leftwich. Bill Bissett, a lot of people will know his work. He lived in Vancouver for many years. Jack Kerouac, the famous beat poet, said in the 60s, long time ago, he said that Bill was one of the greatest living poets. And Bill's still at it. It's 80 years of age. This is his 80th birthday this year, and he wanted me to give him some images for a visual art show that he was curating in Toronto. And I said, well, how about you give me some visual poems, and I'll feed them to Aleph Null, this software that I wrote, and then I'll give you some of that stuff for your visual poetry show in Toronto. And he gave me some recent stuff that this third one here has a lot of the recent stuff. It sort of looks like code. It's you know, it looks quite contemporary, done with the computer. And the other stuff is actually stuff that I did later. Well, it uses images that I got later. I like the results that I was getting so much that I went to SFU's special collections and took 300 photos of Bill's work from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And so these images are a mixture of Bill's work from the 60s through to current time. You know, there's a lot of stuff that he did with typewriters, a lot of hand-drawn stuff. And then on the other hand, there's the more contemporary stuff that he did with the computer. So these have a really wide range of work of Bill Bissett, who's a really special poet, especially in Vancouver. I'd also like to thank Opus in Coquitlam. They did the printing and the framing of these, and were really helpful through that whole process. They're called face-mounted, and so it was interesting process to work with them and get these done. So I guess finally a few remarks about the nature of the project, the Aleph Null project. All of the images were created with Aleph Null. Well, actually, one of them was created with DB Cinema, an earlier graphic synthesizer that I wrote. Both of them I call graphic synthesizers, in that they sample from images like an audio synthesizer samples from sound. So I call it a graphic synthesizer, and I've been working on this since 2011, an earlier one since 2005 called DB Cinema. And so it's a combination of visual poetry, visual poetry, visual art, computer art, which is really dear to my heart. Computer art, I think it was a new form of art. And so the project is between all those arts. This is my first show of prints since 1999, actually. All my work has been for the screen for the most part. And the work that I showed in 1999 was much less ambitious than this stuff in all sorts of ways. But so now I add this new dimension to it of an actual visual art show rather than just on the screen, and usually on the internet. Mostly I'm a net artist, but anyway, and finally I'd like to thank you all for coming. And there's food over there, and there's wine and beer and other drinks downstairs for sale. And so thanks for coming. Let's have a good time.
Jim, tell us where Aleph Null comes from, that the term. Since I've gotten to know you, it's almost as though he's a person. There's a kind of a character that rings in my ears, and I just wonder if you can give us some idea where the term comes from.
Well, Aleph Null is actually a term for mathematics. It's the work of Georg Cantor, was his name, from the late 1800s, and he did some work that I studied as an undergraduate in set theory, where he actually proved some things worth knowing about infinity, which I think is quite amazing. Proving things worth knowing about infinity is just amazing. And not only is it amazing in that regard, the proofs are the most beautiful mathematical proofs I've ever seen. And so the name is a kind of a homage to this guy's work that is art in a very real and beautiful sense. It's beautiful work. So that's where the name comes from. And this work is at the level of programming. It's sort of like drawing with math. You know, it's to get the brushes to do what they're abstract shapes. Some of them are abstract curves or polynomials or whatever. So you take a polynomial and then you fill it with part of an image, and then you move that polynomial or transform that polynomial. So it's sort of drawing with math. It's not as beautiful as Cantor's transfinite arithmetic, but you know.
Quick question. How did you make this one?
Well,
I actually like this one.
Thank you. Well, the brush strokes in that particular piece and in some of the other ones are circles. So each of the big circles that you see that has a black outline is a brush stroke. The basic idea of Aleph Null is that you create brushes and then you assign to a particular brush a set of images, and then the brush samples from that set of images and then does brush strokes. Well, the brush strokes that brush does are circles, and what you see inside each circle is a composited thing of Bill Bissett poems, of sampling from 300 Bill Bissett poems.
And what about the words that are all sort of really abstract, and especially the words that you've like gotten around on this?
Right. Well, part of the idea of...
And there's some, like, I mean, I noticed you have some East Indian words as well.
Right. Well, part of the idea particularly for the show, was to create some work with Bill's work that is really interestingly readable. Mm-hmm. You know, so that you can read it sort of like a novel. You know, it's not like a novel, but You can read it for a good long time, and it's interesting to read. And so his work is already palimpsesty. He uses the word palimpsest in some of the stuff that I've read of his. And a palimpsest it's a no problem. It's a like, for instance, Archimedes' book on method. We have only as palimpsest. It's you don't even see Archimedes writing on this page. It's one thing under another. Archimedes' book on method was recovered from books where when you look at the page, you don't see his work at all. It's been erased, and something has been written over top of it. And so the only way that they could get Archimedes' book, of which there was no other copy, was through special photography to see things that were erased. And so, layers, one underneath another. And so his work is already palimpsesty. And not only is it palimpsesty and, there's layers, but his method of composition is already using random methods, and, his poetry is already, it's already there with, the sort of random processes that I incorporate into my work. So, there's on that right-hand side, for instance, there's probably, I don't know how many poems there are that are layered and juxtaposed together.
Right.
Quite a few.
And I noticed, you have some random words over here which I've never really heard of.
Well, those are I think those are anagrams of earth. The word earth.
Right. Okay.
Earth, fire, air, and water.
Oh, okay, right.
And Jim, I had a question on that. Following media art for a long time, fonts, words that show up visually, which is, say, are some kind of font. It's been very, very hard to put it in art, right? If you think of some of the Cubist work, they put in a few words, and if you think of modern, even music videos when I was doing them, it's almost folly when you try and put in too many words. It just turns to mush. And yet they have meaning, so you want to be able to read it, but then you're using it figuratively. So I've seen it. A lot of people avoid it, put it that way, or it hasn't worked. There was a very famous Prince video that's amazing, where he gets out of a car and these words are spilling out, and it was, I know the person who did it took years to try and get it right. It's really tricky. So with this notion of these brushes, I tend to think they're almost like hoses because there's stuff coming out of them. How do you deal with just this notion of too many words? If words are just on top of other words, they're really just letter decorations that are just, so there's this thing about making them readable, but still, again, even with CNN, people put words on backgrounds and send them across just because they mend into the background, and it just becomes a mess. So you seem to have solved that with your work in a dynamic way. So how do you do that where it's not too, are you just careful to splatter a little and pull back and kind of, or is that really a little bit more in the way it works?
Well, for one thing, I have my wife, who is a student of yours.
Too many words.
And she was actually quite helpful in that regard, actually. In that, that's a problem, of course. You just get word salad, or you get something that isn't readable at all. Because the words aren't well defined visually, you can't distinguish one from the other. And that was actually really helpful in allowing me to see that the part of the job here is comes from the fact that, yeah, you're always introducing noise. You're always, because these brushes are, as you say, sort of like, you know, hoses, and they're noisy in the sense that noise is, you know, an obliteration of signal. So part of the job is to keep the hose going, but to somehow retrieve and create and manufacture at the same time signal. So in terms of signal and noise, it's a challenge to create definition of the words, of the individual words, create definition of the individual images. And so, like, for instance, with the Bissett stuff, I took these 300 poems of Bill's, and I worked with each of them in Photoshop, haloing the text, for instance, creating PNG versions of the poems where, you know, a PNG is an image that has transparent parts. So I'd take a Bill poem and I'd delete the background, but before I deleted it, I would halo the text. You see these texts have space around the words, space around the letters. So I would create these halos and then I'd delete the background, so not all the background, but, and so that was part of the job of, you know, creating signal and definition, and yet letting the hose go all the same, you know. And so it was a variety of techniques to, like that, to salvage or create, manufacture signal from quite a noisy process.
Could you talk a little bit about color? Because this one is my favorite here, this second one up. But I love, but you can see part of it is more textural without that much color, but then there's a section to the right that's, and it feels like it's depth, like that color is 3 down, you know, as if there's, so how do you, and obviously that's not in Bill's poem, so you're actually putting in some imagery, I guess, that's layered?
Well, actually, that one that you mentioned, that the color is actually from a book of his. It's from an artist book that he wrote called Lunaria, which is all hand done, hand lettered, no typewriters, it's all hand drawn. And you can see, like, for instance, there's a little bit more from that book in, say, this area right here, in this piece, and even the red here, and the green, you can see the handwriting in this. So I did draw somewhat from that book, Lunaria, which is all hand done, hand colored, everything's hand done. But the palette, for the most part, in the Bill stuff, is Bill Bissett, Blue Ointment Press, 1960s, which is already a little, it's lost some of its saturation because it's from the 60s. But it already was not the sort of full color photograph or palette that you see in contemporary work. It's a literary press, even though it was a really fine visual poetry press from the 60s, it's still, you know, limited palette. And the palette is mostly Bill Bissett, Blue Ointment Press, 1960s. Although, you know, there is that stuff from his artist book.
Yeah, that's a nice color.